What frustrates me is like, how much are we taking away from the illicit market? There's no government that is really looking at that as a success factor. Why is that?
The way that it typically works is that policymakers already know what they want and they just go looking for the evidence to support it, right?
Let's talk about this new law. Can you take us through what the threat is?
Their solution is a hammer, introduce frictions in the medical system, kind of, force people to go back to the illicit market, which is a negative outcome for everyone, other than the illicit market, of course.
It's almost like the illicit market as a lobby. What is the outcome that they actually want?
I don't know. That's a really good question. Too many patients are having access to cannabis. That must be wrong.
Must be wrong.
At least that's the thinking of some policymakers. What they are not addressing is the demand that is still there. And it's not going away.
What would you say people need to be prepared for? What can people expect? Whether this is a North American trying to move into the European market or German market, but also for German operators, what is there to look out for?
There's a lot to unpack there, right? For context,
we're seeing merger and acquisitions happening almost every week. Why is everyone consolidating, acquiring, and making those moves that I thought were going to happen back in 2025? Now, what has happened?
Often these acquisitions are happening with some...
So it makes so much sense.
I'm originally from Uruguay and I moved to Germany back in 2013 to do a master's degree in public policy, focused on drug policy in particular. Then I became quite known in the industry for my work at MJBizDaily, and shortly after I started working for an investment company with a mandate to invest in the European cannabis industry, particularly in Germany. Became a CFA charter holder.
Anything you're excited about?
I'm fully back in the cannabis industry now. Everything is interesting in the cannabis industry.
The Cannabis Conversation, powered by Lumino. Exploring the legal cannabis industry and the people shaping it. Today's guest is Alfredo Pascual, CFA, Head of Strategy and Corporate Development at Cannamedical, one of Europe's leading independent medical cannabis companies. Now, on to the show.
Perfect. Alfredo, thank you so much for coming. It's your fourth time on the episode now, right?
Yep. Thank you. Thank you for, first of all, thank you for resuscitating the podcast. I mean, it was such a big thing back in the old days.
Yeah.
And yeah, somewhat curious that it's the fourth time I am in the podcast. I think you never had anyone even 3 times. I may be wrong about that, but certainly not 4 times. And while I was on the train coming here, I was partially listening to the old episodes in which I participated. And it's kind of fascinating to go, back in history and
Absolutely.
hear things I was saying back in 2019, then again in 2020, and then again in 2021. And yeah, the first one was the number 15. I was in the episode 15.
Wow. Right from the beginning. It's no surprise that Anuj invited you over so many times when it comes to understanding a regulatory framework or the regulatory landscape in Europe in general. There's nobody else that I usually use as a resource. It's you and Kenzie that I always ask questions to. So this is an absolute given. And when I would try to create an episode talking about the regulations in the European market now, the first name that came to mind was you, of course. So I'm super excited to have you on, and this time in video.
Thank you. Yeah, things have changed, right? About these old episodes, just shortly for context. The first one was about the German market, and that was recorded in mid-2019. So things were kind of just getting started after the change of the law in 2017. The second one was about European report that I wrote when I was at MJBizDaily back in 2019, 2020. And it was about the 2019 European markets. And just for context, I estimated the markets in the calendar year 2019 to have been around 250 million. So we are way past those days now.
Amazing.
And the third one was in 2021. That was right after the previous government coalition in Germany had announced in its coalition agreement that they wanted to legalize cannabis. They didn't say it like that, but they signaled that it was going to be like in Canada, with shops and everything. And everyone was obviously super excited about what was coming with the previous government. But yeah, nobody really, or few people could have predicted back then how it was going to develop. That, well, full legalization didn't happen, but then we had a massive growth in the medical market, right?
Yeah, really interesting. Looking back at your predictions, how many of them were accurate? Like, how do you feel about those? I feel like they were very accurate, if not like very respectfully or not respectful. Like,
I guess I'm very cautious, right? In the way that I word my predictions, so I end up being lucky about it. But I think it's a fascinating episode, especially the third one that I did, mostly about Germany and about the incoming change of government and the promise of full legalization. Because actually it was there that I mentioned a couple of things. Not just I, there were other 2 panelists as well, right? And we all broadly agreed One, that it was not going to be easy to do full legalization, especially because of international law and particular European law considerations. Later, we can go more deeply into that if you want. And second, towards the end of the episode, there's a pretty fascinating thing to hear now, because really no one was thinking about back then. Everyone was thinking about, all right, how do I get retail shops to sell to adults in Germany in the future? And what I found fascinating was the conversation about the medical market, and that, you know what, that's kind of the low-hanging fruit for the incoming government, because they will face little to no opposition to have a more, liberal and access to medicinal cannabis. And that's actually what happened, right? That we didn't get full legalization. Well, we got the Pillar 1, and we can talk about that later as well if you want. But what we did get that was massive was the growth in the medicinal market in Germany, right?
Here is Alfredo, back in 2021, predicting what the future would look like.
This is still extremely bullish for us because of the changes that it could have in the medical market first, the new government, I mean. And Francie made some very good points there. And I would add that we could even expect some minor but perhaps meaningful reforms of the medical program that would improve access to medical cannabis in Germany, and for which there would be literally no opposition. I don't think anyone would oppose that within Germany, or at least not in a big way. And I don't think there would be any international opposition to that as well. So it could be a very easy win for the new government to say, hey, we are improving things for patients. Now the medical program in Germany works better. More patients have access to it.
Absolutely. I think there was also this preconception that as soon as recreational opens up, the medical market will fall. Whereas really, when the partial legalization came, the one winning side of the industry was the medical cannabis market. What do you think happened there? For me, the understanding is Pillar 2 never came. So you had to fit some sort of recreational structure or hype, kind of all went into the medical side of things. And then it's also just in terms of convenience for the consumer that then won. Any insights there? What do you think actually developed?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, right? For context, when the previous government, led by the SPD, the Social Democrats, figured out that they couldn't really fulfill the promise of, let's call it, full legalization like in Canada, they came up with the idea of the two pillars, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Starting with Pillar 2, which was the one that didn't happen, that was the concept of experiments, pilot projects, so limited in scope and time and probably region, to allow selling cannabis to adults under the facade or the justification of that being a scientific experiment. That never really developed beyond a concept, let's say. But what did happen was the Pillar 1, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as you say, that the result of the Pillar 1 was, the massive growth in the medicinal cannabis industry that benefited from it. But there were a few things that were put together into that Pillar 1, right? One was the cannabis clubs. They are not called clubs exactly in Germany, but that's how people typically call them. But they were so overly regulated from the get-go that they never really had a chance to compete against the more established medicinal cannabis industry, especially after the removal of cannabis from the narcotics list. That was what really changed things for the medicinal industry in Germany. The narcotics prescription was not required any longer. And that meant, much easier, less bureaucratic to handle the product. And also it meant that prescriptions from other EU countries or European Economic Zone had to be accepted by German pharmacies that only had to check, formal requirements. So that expanded telemedicine massively.
Mm-hmm.
And and as you're saying, it's now extremely hard to compete against the legal medicinal cannabis industry just because of pricing, convenience, variety. Everything is there to benefit, let's say, the medicinal cannabis industry. And then the other thing that was hoped for but never really happened was to try to push these experiments for adult use cannabis that were supposed to be part of the second pillar. But when the second pillar didn't happen, some people saw an article in the first pillar law that was about research and thought, all right, let's try to push applications for experiments through that article. Well, the applications were submitted, and it was kind of curious that the submission was accepted as well. But all of the decisions that have been made so far for these types of applications, for pilot experiments to sell cannabis to adults, were rejected because that was not really the intention of the Pillar 1 research clause. It was more about plant research and research in genetics, things like that, not to have a market.
Has that come to an end yet in terms of, or because I'm still seeing people trying to put applications in? Is that a lack of understanding, or has there been kind of a cutoff now by the government saying like this isn't going to happen?
I mean, you can still try. The chances are very low, right? I mean, every decision that has been made so far has been negative for these types of applications. I don't know how many are pending reply, but it would be very hard to approve one of the pending ones or new ones when the justification that was given broadly for the previous rejections was that there's no legal basis to approve them, right? So if there's no legal basis for, I don't know, whatever the number is, let's say 20 that were rejected already, you cannot then say that there is legal basis for application number 21. So I think the chances are extremely low of any of these applications being approved. And there's also a paper from the scientific services of the Bundestag that delved deep into this and basically backs the government in the sense of saying, I'm saying it in paraphrasing in non-legal terms, of course, but it basically says that, yeah, the government is right. There is no legal basis under Pillar 1 for this. It should have been done under Pillar 2, but Pillar 2 never happened. So with the research clause in Pillar 1, the chances of having pilot projects to sell adult use to cannabis to users are very low, right? And
Let's talk about this new law. So obviously we had the partial legalization back in 2024, huge surge in the market. I think in 2025, I'm seeing numbers up to like 200 tons that were imported. And now the health minister is kind of ruffling the feathers of the industry by threatening with changes of regulations. Can you take us through what the threat is? And now it seems like everyone is looking at these threats in a much more positive light. Why is that?
Positive, probably, to be clear, that the threats will not materialize or materialize in a milder way. Not positive about the threats, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Just to be clear, right? Yeah, let's start kind of at the beginning if you want. I mean, and if it gets too detailed, you stop me, right? But it all started last summer, German summer, of course, when there was a proposal from the Ministry of Health, as you correctly said, to basically do two big things. One, limit telemedicine. It's not a total telemedicine ban, as some say or some news have said. It is not that it would be completely forbidden to do telemedicine for cannabis, but it would be very restricted in the sense that the first prescription would have to be after an in-person consultation for cannabis. And then basically once a year, you would have to go see a doctor again in person in order to get that new prescription. So that's the first big restriction. And the second other big thing is shipping cannabis to patients would also be forbidden. Again, it's not like a total prohibition because you would still have the pharmacy local courier, right? The Botendienst. So pharmacies within their own neighborhood of influence could still deliver. But obviously, it's a massive restriction compared to the situation that we have now, where a single pharmacy can ship all across the country, right? Yeah. So those were the two big things. And those two things, if adopted as the law amendment is currently written, would have a big impact in the industry, at least initially. As you said correctly, the Ministry of Health ruffled the feathers last year, started with that. I guess one negative signal, or I think a signal that was perceived negatively last year as well, was that things moved relatively fast initially. So I don't remember if it was June or July that the first Referentenentwurf, the draft from the Ministry of Health, was circulated, but it was around June or July. And then shortly after, it had been already approved by the cabinet, the executive government, and then shortly after sent to the Bundesrat, the higher house of parliament in Germany that represents the states. The Bundesrat doesn't need to formally approve the law amendment, but they can intervene in the process, and they did so, and also in a very swift way. They had their commissions, mainly Health Commission, evaluate the law amendment, and at the commission or committee level, they proposed, I think it was 5 further restrictions to the law amendment, things that would have made it even more strict, let's say. Out of these 5, 3 were approved at the plenary of the Bundesrat as recommendations to the government to amend the law amendment to introduce further restrictions. These 3 were: 1, to shut down prescriptions for cannabis being issued from other European countries for
doctors outside of Germany.
For patients in Germany, and that's a big thing. We can talk about that later because that's a key issue of the current situation. That was a big one. The other one was one about standardizing pricing at the pharmacy level. So as most know, there's competition among pharmacies, to offer cheaper prices or better service, but the price for a single product is not the same at every pharmacy. So they wanted to standardize that.
Mm-hmm.
And the third one was about explicitly saying that there's an advertisement ban for medicinal cannabis. So these were the three that were adopted at the plenary of the higher house. That went back to the cabinet, the German government, and then the cabinet rejected two of these and said one, they would consider it. They rejected the one of advertising, not because they want advertising for cannabis, but because they said that is already banned. Like, we cannot ban it again, right? Cannabis is a prescription medicine, and because of it is a prescription medicine, and we also have recent court cases like confirming this, advertising medicinal cannabis to patients, so outside, Fachkreise, doctors and pharmacists, is already forbidden. So we don't need to say it is forbidden when it's already forbidden.
Mm-hmm.
Then they said they were going to evaluate the one about pricing, standardization, and then the big one about shutting down prescriptions from other European countries. They rejected it. They basically argued that it wouldn't be possible because of EU law. So that was the cabinet, then sent back to the Bundestag, and all this very swiftly in a matter of just a few months. And then the Bundestag had its first hearing, mostly about, political positioning. Nothing very substantial happened there. Then there was a hearing with experts in January.
Mm-hmm.
And then is when things starting to slow down, I would say. Nothing or not much has happened directly related to the law amendment in February and March so far, right? We'll see how this develops further, and we can talk about that, like what could happen.
Yeah.
But yeah, the process slowed down significantly after January. It was very fast in the second half of last year, slowed down in January. I don't know exactly why. Probably this is being negotiated within the government forces behind closed doors, and also in the context of several other issues that they have. And the outcome is probably relatively very hard to predict. That's one thing. And the other is probably the issue about prescriptions from other European countries that would continue, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of the law. So it would be kind of silly if it is approved as it is currently written, because they couldn't shut down telemedicine if that is being done by doctors outside of Germany, right? So you could still have doctors in whatever other European country, EU or European Economic Zone, issuing prescriptions to patients in Germany via telemedicine without an in-person consultation. And then the patient would go to the German pharmacy, and the German pharmacy would have to check the formalities of the prescription, but the pharmacist cannot, ask you for proof that you went to see a doctor, I don't know, in Malta, right? Or whatever. So yeah, the restrictions would apply to doctors in Germany, but in practice not outside Germany. And that would even, arguably it would make things worse, right? Because if what legislators want is to have in-person consultations, but this only would apply in practice to doctors in Germany, then it would mean that the market would shift outside of Germany for
100%.
telemedicine. Because why would you even bother?
That's not
right?
a problem for operators. They were trying to do that anyway because it was cheaper.
I think that's the biggest issue of the law right now, and the biggest issue why it's not advancing. And the fix for that is very complicated because of EU law that has a higher rank over German law. There's a specific directive. I think it is a directive, maybe it's something else, but I think it is a European directive. There may be other solutions, and I'm certainly not a lawyer, but I think the only straightforward solution is politically not really viable, and it is to schedule cannabis as a narcotic again. Because if it were a narcotic, then you would have to use, the narcotic prescriptions, and it could be easier controlled by the German government again. But because it is not a narcotic, is that doctors outside of Germany can simply write the normal prescription. But yeah, to schedule it as a narcotic again, I don't think that will happen if the SPD is part of the government, that they would be assuming a big error that they did in the last period when they were leading the government and led this law. So I don't think it's going to happen. It's not politically realistic. But that's probably the only real solution that they have, unless they come up with some other solution to both shut down telemedicine or at least mandate an in-person consultation every year and have a way to enforce it. Because if they don't have a way to enforce it, it's, just political posturing. They may do it anyways, right?
Yeah.
Just for, for the sake of saying we had to do something and we did something. But I don't think it will have the outcomes that they would want to have.
What is the outcome that they actually want?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I mean, obviously, so you mentioned it, right? Imports grew massively, right? It was 70 something tons in 2024 and then 201 tons in 2025. And that is what the government is using to say this is wrong because imports are growing like too fast, too much. The market is growing too fast. Something's wrong with that. We need to fix it, and we are gonna use a hammer to fix it, right? But what is it that they want? That's a really good question. Because first of all, they are interpreting that because imports grew, that's necessarily wrong, and it means that there is abuse in the system, as in people who do not really need prescriptions taking advantage of the opportunity that it is now so easy to get a prescription for cannabis in Germany and get it delivered to your home, right? So that's the core analysis that they are doing. But there are a couple of problems with that. The first one is that I would say when the previous government changed the law, among other things, removing cannabis from the narcotics list, arguably they expected imports to increase. I mean, they expected the market to grow.
Of course.
They expected more patients to have access to it. Otherwise, why would they do
Change
it? Right?
anything. Yeah.
I mean, that was arguably an intention. It was not an unintended consequence. It was an intention that more people get access to medicinal cannabis, and as a consequence, because very little is grown in Germany compared to what's imported, imports would grow massively, right? So that's the first thing. And I think it was, I mean, in retrospective, it's easy to say, but it's probably a wasted opportunity that when the law changed with the previous government, they didn't really had a framework to evaluate it in the sense of, all right, we predict that imports, that the unmet medical need is whatever in volume or number of patients or something, some metric to then evaluate with what happened in the market, right? To my knowledge, there was no study determining what is the unmet medical need in Germany that would be met if we remove cannabis from the narcotics list and we make it easier for doctors to prescribe to patients in Germany. That was not done, right? So, I mean, one could argue removing it from the narcotics list meant they intended more access, but they didn't say how much more, right? So
So then when the number just grew by 400%,
exactly.
It was too much.
And now the current government, with another, let's say, political view on cannabis, led by the CDU and CSU, Christian Democratic Party, is using the fact that imports grew too much to say this must mean something is wrong. But they are not differentiating between, all right, how much of these imports are going to patients that previously had no access to it because it was just too complicated to have access to it, and now because the barriers to access are lower, they are benefiting from access to medicinal cannabis, versus how much of that is going to people that are abusing the system. There's no study done there, right? So that's the starting point that I think is not exactly right, to say because imports increase too much, we must do something about it, and we must introduce friction in the system, because that's also very unfair with patients that truly need it, right? The solution that the government is proposing is frictions for everyone, right? That the government is kind of saying, we know there's some abuse. We don't know how much the abuse is because we don't know, how many should be having access to it as a patient and how many are abusing the system. So what we're going to do is to make life miserable for everyone, right? I mean, not life miserable, but to make it more complicated for everyone, right? Even for those patients that truly need it, right? And that's not the right way to fix things if you want to do it, more properly. And then to your question, what do they want? That's also, I think, a flaw of the current law amendment draft. It doesn't really say, again, they're suffering kind of the same problem, that they are not saying what is the ideal outcome of this. They want to introduce frictions in the system, hoping that would, for instance, reduce imports. But they are not saying, you know what, in the ideal outcome, we would want imports to decrease by X%, or we would want the number of patients to be X based on these studies that were done of, how many patients Germany should have. None of that. They're just saying, we're just going to make it more complicated. We hope that this will, have an impact in the market and reduce the number of patients, but they are not being upfront about, all right, what's the right number of patients, right?
100%. What frustrates me is like to your argument of if they wanted to, with Pillar 1, they wanted to increase medical access by introducing the two-pillar concept, and therefore Pillar 2, they also by default wanted to increase access for recreational use, right? So you could look at the two-pillar solution and say, okay, we wanted to find a way to, have responsible consumption in recreational and in medical, But overarching, what I loved about the solution was we're taking power back from the illicit market, basically. And in total, the product is safer to use. Actually, quality standards are being properly met. And now it just seems like this whole kind of public health argument is going away, and they're just trying to, yeah, like you said, trying to make everyone's life a bit more difficult at the expense of people that actually need it.
Yeah, I guess their counter argument, to try to be fair, would be yes, it is true that from a public health point of view, it would be better that consumers, not patients, have access to regulated, safe product under a legal and controlled supply chain. However, it's not the job of doctors and pharmacists to provide access to cannabis to people who are not patients, right?
Mhm.
That would be their counter argument. And how I would counter argue that is with what you said, right? There's a structural issue here that already started with the previous government, that what was intended as a two-pillar system ended up being as a one-pillar system. And within that one-pillar system, they made the life so complicated for cannabis associations that they never really, at least so far, they haven't really been able to provide a significant part of the supply that is needed for recreational users or adult use cannabis. So there's a structural tension there that the previous government made access much easier to medicinal cannabis, with the concept of, all right, we're going to have cannabis associations that will be the escape valve, or the ones that will provide access for adult use cannabis. And in a second pillar, we will have, limited experiments that would also provide access to it. But then the second pillar never really happened. The first pillar, the clubs only had limited success so far. And now we have this tension there, right? So what can the current government do? Obviously, make life simpler for clubs, but there's no political willingness to do that. So their solution is a hammer, introduce frictions in the medical system, and kind of, force people to go back to the illicit market, which is a negative outcome for everyone.
For everyone.
Other than the illicit market, of course.
Other than the illicit market. And it seems like the structure right now is affecting the illicit market, right? Not only are we seeing patients, I mean, even for me here in Munich, why would I go into some dingy alley and buy something from a street dealer if I can just have the product at my house within 60 minutes, and I know that it comes from a safe source.
Convenient price and so many varieties.
Exactly. I mean, we're completely competing with the illicit market in terms of the medical side of things, from quality, transparency, obviously, which is a huge win. And then the price. I mean, the price has gone from around €8 per gram to under €5 now. So it's completely just to compete with the illicit market. There was even a statement in that a street dealer mentioned how it's very hard to compete with pharmacies that are legal and have that kind of price point that they're offering in quality.
There was an article yesterday, the Apotheca sin Crasso or something like that,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
The dealer was saying, yeah, they cannot compete. They cannot compete. It's very hard.
Yeah. And now they're just making it easier for them again. It's almost like the illicit market as a lobby.
Yeah, that's the problem, introducing frictions in a system without providing solutions to where that demand is going to go, right? Just because you make it disappear from the legal market doesn't mean that it's going to disappear.
Yeah. And I guess with the health minister ruffling these feathers, we saw, I don't know, from an operational perspective, a lot of companies being unsure on where to go, what direction to take. There was uncertainty in the market over 2025, I believe. Suddenly 2026 hits and we're seeing merger and acquisitions happening almost every week. Why do you think investors, other industries, and the market, why is everyone consolidating, acquiring, and making those moves that I thought were going to happen back in 2025? Now, what has happened to relieve that concern for companies, do you think?
I guess one thing that I would start with is that often these acquisitions are happening with some earnout structure, in that, the headline price that you see in the title of the press release is not the cash that those selling are getting today.
Yeah, like the 250 million for Sanity, for example.
For example, but that's not the only example, right?
Yeah.
So there's usually a component that is, let's say in the case of Sanity, I don't remember if it was exactly half, but it was not far from half of the price was earnouts. So that gives you the signal that obviously the acquirers are enthusiastic about the transaction, but they also recognize that there's risk ahead, be it risk that there's a shift in the market because of regulations changing, for example, or operational risk of the company that they are acquiring, even if the market itself doesn't structurally change. So there's a big earnout component. And yeah, it's not like it's the first time that there's an earnout component that also happened in the old days. But I remember, I don't know, when was it? Like around 2018, 2019, you could see all cash acquisitions up front, right? Like in Germany, probably one of the largest one, like Germany specific, was when Canopy acquired what was then the Bionorica division of Dronabinol. They called it C3, and that was like 200 something million cash upfront right now, right? So that is not happening in 2025 or 2026 that we were mentioning. I haven't seen like
You're
a
right.
100+ million transaction, all cash, let's get it 100% now, right? Perhaps it's also a signal of, the industry becoming more sophisticated as well, and the deals also being a little bit more complex. But yeah, that's the first thing that I would mention, without, any detriment to how exciting these transactions are. Of course, they're big, they're creating a lot of enthusiasm in the market. But yeah, let's recognize that there's an earnout component there, and cash and stock usually as well from the acquirer with a cap as well. Then maybe, once one transaction starts and everyone talks about it, that creates an incentive for others, to not miss the train.
No one wants to be first, but nobody wants to.
Exactly. So that creates momentum, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe there's a momentum there. Obviously, it cannot be ignored what we were just saying, the massive growth in the German market. And then if you want, we can talk about more specifically about how big the German market actually is. But what cannot be ignored is the import number, 70 something to 201 imports, growing pretty much every quarter. The last quarter of last year declined a little bit, the import number, but there may be some reporting lag or something. We'll see once Q1 2026 is published whether the trend changed. But yeah, otherwise the trend has until Q3 last year was rapid growth, massive growth. So that cannot be ignored. Also, while markets in other jurisdictions are also growing, say the UK or Poland, they're still far behind from Germany in terms of total volume of the market, right? So for North American companies in more developed markets that are not growing as fast, let's say in Canada, for example, that need to look for new opportunities, Germany is the one that provides the big volume and the big growth, right? You don't get that elsewhere. I mean, Australia, UK, Poland, those are and maybe other minor markets are all interesting opportunities, but they don't get to the same level of scale of Germany, right? So that's hard to ignore.
For me, there's this milestone that I've been looking at, and I think we just achieved it with the Sanity acquisition, which is when are these big FMCG companies going to move in, or other highly regulated industries like tobacco, alcohol, pharma, and this isn't like the Canopy example, cannabis buying a pharmaceutical asset, but actually the big guys coming in to acquire cannabis companies. And it's always been this thing that I've been looking at where these big companies, they don't pave the road. They wait for the little guys to pave the road and then they buy the road. And this has been the first signal of that happening. I know it was Organogram acquiring Sanity, but by extension, that's British American Tobacco, one of the largest tobacco companies in the world. Has there been a specific trigger? Of course, as you just mentioned, they can see that there's still risk in the market, but why is it now suddenly interesting for these kind of companies to move in? And then we've only seen one acquisition of these really big guys coming in. Like, what made Sanity, do you think, attractive for something like this? Or not to talk about Sanity, but why are these guys moving in is my big question.
I honestly don't know much about Sanity beyond what's publicly known, so it's not like I'm here to say something very insightful about it. But some nuance or correction to what you mentioned, that this being, the first large mainstream industry company acquiring in a large transaction a cannabis company, you're probably not considering the GW acquisition by
That's
Shell,
true.
right?
That's true.
And that was massive. What was that? Like 7-point-something billion a few years ago. But you could also argue, well, they kind of play in a different market, right?
That's why I haven't thought about them.
I mean, they follow the pathway of doing clinical trials and getting drugs approved.
It felt like pharma buying another pharma company.
Correct. I mean, you could counter argue that doesn't count, because it's a different type of, not a different type of cannabis. Cannabis is cannabis at the end of the day.
You're completely right, though.
But a different type of strategy in the sense that it was a company that had approved drugs, whereas companies like Sanity are operators that sell what in the UK you call unlicensed, or Australia unapproved drugs, or magistral preparations in Germany.
I guess what I was trying to see is if there was one part of, the fears that the health minister has created, or one of those, like, the delivery of cannabis being restricted, or doctors from outside of Germany, not like whether there was any of those pillars that is now not a big concern that made these companies say, okay, now is the time to.
If you're going to wait until there's no risk, then the investment may make no sense any longer, right? So there's some calculated risk there of regulatory constraints may or may not happen, may be delayed forever, and if they do happen, maybe watered down from the version of the law that is currently under discussion. And in the meantime, the market is still growing, right? So I guess some companies don't want to miss the train just to wait until there's no risk. And to be honest, I mean, there's always risk in the cannabis industry, right? It's very politically driven, as in it really depends on the next government and their views on cannabis. The current German government won't be in power forever, of course. So maybe the next one is one that is friendlier towards cannabis. And it just makes sense, perhaps, to invest now while things are a little bit turbulent rather than wait for clarity and maybe miss the opportunity.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Alfredo, let's take a little step back because we got right into it. But for the people that haven't seen you on the podcast before, tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into this crazy market, and why you've become this authority in the market when it comes to regulations and understanding the landscape.
Thank you. Well, I guess I don't have, like a fascinating pre-cannabis industry background related to cannabis, like so many people in the industry, people that were passionate about the plant or the effects of cannabis, or, had a family member that was sick and truly benefited from using cannabis, and that drove them to then try to do something in the cannabis industry. I had none of that. But I'm originally from Uruguay, and I moved to Germany back in 2013 to do a master's degree in public policy. And while I was doing that, it was about the time that Uruguay legalized cannabis for all purposes. That was December 2013. And that was huge back in the day, right? I'm talking about 2013. That was the first country to do so on a countrywide level before Canada, of course. Canada, what was 2018, many years later. And I think the only jurisdictions that had done it before Uruguay were Washington and Colorado in the US, and that was about it. I think they did it in 2012. So obviously that was everywhere in the news back in 2013. And while I was doing my master's degree in public policy, that also kind of received a lot of attention because it's a curious policy thing, One thing led to another one, and I started to pay attention to that and focus on that. And then I ended up doing my master's degree focused on drug policy in particular. I even wrote my master's thesis about it. It was out of academic interest, I would say, initially. But then when I finished, I thought, well, I may now try to do something with it. And there weren't that many opportunities. I'm talking about 2016, right? But there was one company with operations in Uruguay that had just listed in the TSX in Canada. And I thought, well, it's because they want to do something outside of Uruguay. Those were the days when Germany was debating about changing the medicinal cannabis law. So pre-2017, there were only like about 1,000 patients that had very exceptional access to, on an individual basis, to
Dronabinol.
No, they had Bedrocan flower as well.
Oh, true.
But it was very, very rare. I'm talking about literally 1,000 patients or about that number. And the law changed in January 2017 and then entered into force in March. That basically created the medicinal market in Germany on a more general level. So I thought I may as well go knock on the door of this company and see if they're interested in exporting to Germany and try to start doing something for them. And that's how it worked, basically. I mean, long story short, I ended up doing international business development for that company at the end of 2016, early 2017. Those were my first steps in the industry. And I guess then I became quite known in the industry for my work at MJBizDaily from 2018 to early 2021. Those were the crazy days of the industry, right? And
Absolutely.
I was, trying to be the voice of reason.
You had the finger on the pulse. It was the voice of reason.
So that was my differentiating factor, right?
Yeah.
Not necessarily being particularly smart or anything, but trying to be reasonable about things.
Yeah, like just going between the hype, like trying to understand the reality between the hype.
So I guess lots of people kind of appreciated, to have that voice back then. So yeah, that's how I became, known in the industry. And then in 2021, I left MJBizDaily, and shortly after, I started working for an investment company, one that was quite known in the European cannabis industry because of some early investments and exits that it had done in Europe that included Nuvera, for example, when it
Still
was
some of the largest exits
yeah, that was
in
huge when
European
Nuvera
cannabis.
was acquired by Afria, and then EMAC when it was acquired by Curaleaf. That was also part of the portfolio and an early investment. And that's when I joined the investment company with a mandate to invest in the European cannabis industry, particularly in Germany. The company is called Seed Innovations, and we did a meaningful investment shortly after I joined in 2021 in Germany in a company called Avextra, a mostly German operator. That then we partially exited at a big premium in 2023. And around 2023 was also the year when we stopped focusing on at least new cannabis investments. At that time, I was also doing my CFA program. I became a CFA charter holder. So around 2024, in particular, I wasn't really paying that much attention to the cannabis market because my daily job was mostly centered on other industries and other types of investments. But it's the cannabis industry is like a magnet, and it pulled me back. So yeah. Long story short, I left the investment company already, and now I'm fully back in the cannabis industry. I thought for a moment, around 2024, is cannabis gonna be a thing of the past for me? But no, now I'm back.
The ups and downs of this industry is the same reason people get addicted to gambling, right? It's the ups and the downs and the ups and the downs. It's addictive, this kind of landscape. Absolutely.
Also with the regulatory changes, 2 steps forward, 1 step back all the time.
Absolutely. And I think with this kind of hype that is building now regarding all of the M&A activity that is going on, I'm really happy to have another voice of reason in the market.
Thank you.
There's a couple of topics that I wanted to discuss. One being around seizures. I read that there's around 50 tons that have been seized on the German border. Is that right? And there is some people that are saying that this is an indicator for a spike in illicit activity or the illicit market. Doesn't make much sense to me, but can you add some color to that? What's going on?
To be clear, this is not my research, but it was a pretty good article, I think, that was published very recently. Paraphrasing and simplifying, what the journalist there did was to first present the 2 points of view of whether the change of the law, so the first pillar, has been a boost for the illicit market in Germany or not. And those that basically want to restrict things with cannabis are saying that because seizures at the border, confiscations of cannabis, have increased so much, that is proof that the law is not really working, and it's just making things easier, for illicit trafficking and dealers. What the story published was that while confiscations throughout 2023 and 2024, I think it was, were around 20-something tons of cannabis, let's call it 25, I think it was. In 2025, preliminary numbers show that it was 50 tons. So this 50 tons is not something that I found published already by authorities, but it was published on this article. So let's assume that is correct, or that is gonna be close to 50 tons. So what that shows is a drastic increase in the cannabis that is being seized at the border.
And this is illicit cannabis.
Illicit, illicit. And it's a fraction of the total consumption of cannabis in Germany, right? And that's also part of the potential explanation, right? So one thing I think it's important to emphasize is that more confiscations or seizure activity doesn't necessarily mean that the illicit market is growing. It may simply be that the police is just paying more attention to it, or has better tools for enforcement, or prioritizing it more than confiscation increases. So that is one point. And the second one, which I found interesting, it's mentioned there that in the past, most of the cannabis coming to Germany was coming via trucks from, say, Spain. And it's very hard for the police to intercept and find all this illicit trafficking into Germany. What they do find is a tiny fraction of the total coming via trucks from, for instance, Spain. But what shifted structurally in the illicit market is that now there's apparently much more cannabis coming from developed markets in North America or from Thailand.
100%.
And this is obviously not coming by truck to Germany. So then having more cannabis seized at the border doesn't necessarily mean that the illicit market is growing, or that cannabis consumption in general in Germany is growing. It is simply that the routes through which it's coming into Germany are changing, shifting from trucks to containers or whatever in ships. That is easier for or the ratio of success for enforcement is higher, and that then means that there's more confiscation. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people are consuming more. And it's also mentioned in the article that this analysis of, how do you say it in English, Kläranlage, what water waste.
In terms of the water analysis. There's been like a basically of the urine, like within
exactly.
the urine of the population. They
exactly.
base it like whether consumption has increased or not.
Exactly. So apparently this is being done. This is being done consistently, and it's not showing any signs of people consuming more. Right. So I think that was a pretty good article.
I think that's an interesting stat in terms of the water analysis, but also they're only looking at one statistic, which is seizures going up, or the amount of seizures, as you just mentioned. But numbers of illicit consumption, for example, is not even a metric that has ever been tracked. Is that right? Like anybody with a kind of scientific approach wouldn't be analyzing the market with the data points that they're actually putting forward, right?
Yeah, you're totally right. Often, cannabis policy is very politically driven, for good or worse, but it's very politically driven. And what that typically means is that the government in place will simply pick whatever they want to make their argument. To be fair, both in terms of, liberalizing the market and in terms of restricting the market, the way that it typically works is that policymakers already know what they want and they just go looking for the evidence to support it, right? And as you correctly mentioned, there's a lack of high quality evidence, right? That was also evidenced last year in a parliamentary inquiry to the German government, in which a bunch of questions were asked. I think it was by the Green Party, or opposition party. For instance, the government explicitly acknowledged that they had no data on, for instance, how many people the legal cannabis industry employs or how much revenue the legal cannabis industry is doing in Germany. A bunch of different metrics that you would think is pretty basic to at least have an estimate of these metrics before, trying to change things drastically. Yet the government is acknowledging, like, we don't know, right? And we are not even trying to figure it out. So then what happens is what you say, right? Seizures of cannabis at the border go up, and that creates a knee-jerk reaction of the government saying, this is because the market, people are consuming more. And it also happened with the imports number that we mentioned before, right? Imports number growing drastically doesn't necessarily mean that most of that growth is explained by abuse in the system. It could simply mean that patients that previously didn't have access because it was too complicated for them now are finally being able to meet their medical needs.
I also think awareness is a huge piece of the puzzle there. I mean, the news, every single news article every day for weeks was talking about the not partial legalization, but the legalization of cannabis in Germany. And I think that's also what moved the needle for a lot of for the whole European medical cannabis industry, is when companies stopped spending millions on educating doctors, but spent that marketing budget on educating consumers. And those doctors that didn't want to initially be educated only woke up once their waiting room had 20 cannabis patients in it saying, I'm here for cannabis. So this idea of public awareness to then drive medical access, I think is something that was kind of how it spiraled.
Yeah, I agree with that. And actually, again, to go back to that old cannabis conversation, I did the third one that was in 2021.
Yeah.
When I was listening to that on the train coming here, one thing that I did mention at the end of that episode is that, because it was all about, how uncertain it's going to be whether the now previous government, back then incoming government, was going to be able to fully legalize cannabis and the different scenarios that could play out. And I said, well, it does matter what scenario plays out, of course, but one outcome is quite certain, and it is that no matter what, cannabis is going to become more normalized in Germany because of the public conversation around cannabis and the attention that it will receive. And that, with time, inevitably leads to broader access.
Here's Alfredo yet again back in 2021, predicting what the future would look like.
In a way, the genie is out of the bottle. There's no way that they can go back and say, we will do nothing now. They could do it, but they would have to pay a huge political cost. So they will have to do something. Cannabis will become more mainstream in Germany, will be in the news more often. So I think that's the very positive step, even if this takes longer than what some may wish.
I also saw when, again, those feathers were ruffled by the health minister early on last year, you saw all the big distributors and brands in the market doing their own kind of research and analysis with their patient and audience. And it across, whether it was Bloomwell, Sanity, Cannamedical, all the bigger players for 20, most of their analysis said that if access is restricted in the form of deliveries, especially people living in rural areas, the patient feedback was very clear, like, okay, well, if this is made difficult for us, we will go straight back to the illicit market. And that seems to me like the obvious incentive once that is presented.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think it's great that, companies in the sector try to do surveys and analysis. Would be great if also from the government side, we could have to try to measure things before trying to, change them with a hammer. And that's what's lacking, measuring the market, measuring the unmet medical need, comparing it with more developed markets and see what, I don't know, something as simple as what percentage of the population has access to medical cannabis in markets that have been around for longer, like, say, Israel or others, and how does that compare with Germany, for example, to see if things make sense. And again, I mean, obviously, you cannot really compare one-to-one because the situations are different and the frameworks are different as well, but to give you an idea, right? But first of all, I think it would be great if the government would make an effort to measure the legal market, right?
The illicit market.
And the illicit one as well, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's such a missed metric, or like a success factor, is how much, or from a percentage, like how much are we taking away from the illicit market? I don't know why, and there's no government that is really looking at that as a success factor, which is frustrating to me.
Yeah, it is. To be fair, there's the EcoCan study that I think it's mandated by the government, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
And I think they do, I don't remember now off the top of my head if they measure it or if they analyze it based on other primary sources. But I think they have estimated the illicit market in their preliminary report that was published a bunch of months ago. And now there's another one that will be published shortly after we're doing this interview. And certainly by the time this podcast will be published, that report will be available.
Amazing.
But in the previous edition, it was some sort of preliminary edition. I'm trying to remember, but I think they mentioned something around 600 to 800 tons being the total consumption of cannabis in Germany.
Including medical.
Everything, yeah. Better check the source directly, but I think it was something around 600 to 800 tons. But yeah, I don't remember if that is based on other primary sources.
Super interesting, though. I mean, it would be interesting to compare. Is there a split between this is medical and this is recreational? I guess you can just take the 200 tons off the 800 tons and say that's a... Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see whether that actually influenced anything, really.
Yeah, but in a nutshell, I mean, you're right. Measure things is important. Also have, I guess, success metrics before changing the law in terms of the expected outcomes. So what do you expect the outcome to be? Otherwise, you will always have a new government that may interpret it the way they want, right? If they want to interpret negatively, they will interpret it negatively. If they want to interpret it positively, they will interpret it positively, right? What we were mentioning before, when the previous government removed cannabis from the narcotics list and imports then increased, that could be interpreted in two ways, right? One is positive. I mean, that was the intention of the law, to provide broader access. The other is negative. That means there's abuse in the system. And because there was no a priori analysis of what the right number or the right range, let's say broad range, should have been, then any developments in the market can be interpreted in two different opposite ways, driven by politics rather than analysis. And then when something is changed, you use the right tools, right? Not just introduce frictions everywhere. If there's abuse in the system with, I don't know, specific clinics or whatever that are not following the best protocols, go against them, but not make life more complicated for everyone.
No, so it makes so much sense. Maybe I'm naive, but I just always think, like, if we have this, if a success metric would be to take as much away from the illicit market, now at some point, most of the market is legal. It's much easier to enforce any sort of regulations to the legal market than it is to any sort of illicit market. So it's not a no-brainer. It's just, I don't know.
Well, I guess from the current government's point of view, the tension is that they do not want access to legal cannabis to be done under a facade of medicinal cannabis.
To me. That makes sense to me. But they created that themselves.
Yeah. and they don't have a proposal, right? What are we going to do? Why don't make it, life simpler for clubs? that clubs can be a meaningful part of the legal supply.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question whether clubs is even the right tool for it. But
yeah, going beyond clubs starts getting complicated because of EU law, right? Even, I mean, we could argue about the experiments. That's, I would say, a gray zone, whether this can be truly justified under international law. I mean, there's usually ways to try to justify it, but it's not clear cut.
Mhm.
But when it comes to creating a, full-fledged recreational market, like in Canada, that's currently not possible in Europe.
That's simply EU. Okay.
That's a European framework decision from 2004. I think it's number 757 something, but certainly from 2004. It's about illicit trade of drugs, and simplifying what it does is to implement on a European level the single convention of 1961. And the problem is that the enforcement mechanism, or the problem for those who want to legalize cannabis on a full scale, let's say, is that the enforcement mechanisms of, for example, the European Commission are much different and scarier, let's say, than the enforcement mechanisms of the 1961 convention, right? So one could think or question, if Canada did it or Uruguay did it, why couldn't Germany do it? And big part of the explanation is that EU law is the big hurdle there.
That makes sense.
In that framework decision from 2004, there is an exception carved out there for cannabis that is being produced, I think it says, or grown or whatever, for personal use. And as a stretch of the personal use concept, you could have clubs.
Mhm.
But then going beyond cannabis associations or clubs for a fully developed market, that is much harder to justify on a European Union level. So that's a big bottleneck.
That makes sense. And I guess it's based around really limiting the commercialization of it. That's also the social club. It's not supposed to be a commercial structure. No one's really making money in this. It's like an association where people can indulge. But
Yeah.
if you ask anybody who owns social clubs, which run under different regulations in Spain, or run coffee shops in the Netherlands, none of them have opened up a single social club here in Germany, not because the market isn't there, but because the structure doesn't allow for any sort of commercial.
That's very unfortunate. And it's something that I have seen repeatedly over the past years in different jurisdictions. And I think it's often a failure of even cannabis friendly policymakers, that when they have the political willingness and capability with whatever necessary majorities are needed, they tend to go the pathway of so-called, strict regulation, which sounds great on paper, right? For them as policymakers to say, yes, we are going to legalize it in some way, but we're going to make it very restrictive because, we care about the children and all of that,
Sure.
right? But with the argument of we care about the children and we're going to make it very complicated, then it's a self-defeating thing, right?
It's half-assed.
Yeah, because as we were talking about the clubs in Germany, they end up creating structures that are just unworkable. I think we have a similar example in Malta, that they also legalized clubs, but they made it so complicated for clubs to operate there. The legal supply remained very small. It makes no sense to say we are, or at least in my opinion, it makes no sense to say we're going to legalize it to reduce illicit market activity. And from a public health point of view, it would be great if people that already consume consume cannabis especially could have access to a legal supply. But we're going to make it so complicated that at the end of the day it's not going to work, right? So
Yeah.
just go ahead and do it in a simple way.
Again, it just comes back to what you said. It's politically driven.
Yeah, that's an easier sell, especially to those who oppose any change, than saying we are going to legalize it and have the free market take care of it, right? The problem with that is that then if very strict means things are unworkable, you wasted time and energy and political capital in doing something that was very limited in its outcome.
Absolutely.
There's another great example about this, and that's my home country, Uruguay. When it was legalized back in 2013, all parts of the market, be it hemp, medical, and adult use, were very restrictive. But when it came to the adult use market, it was extremely restrictive, right? Some had the expectation that if we were to start with a very strict regulatory framework, then things as years go by would, become more flexible and liberal. But it has been extremely hard to introduce changes to that initial framework from 2013. To be fair, some things have changed, but very limited. And it's still, kind of silly that tourists still cannot buy legal cannabis in Uruguay, right? So if you go to Uruguay as a tourist and you want to have access to adult use cannabis, you basically need to go to the illicit market because there's no legal pathway for you to have access to it, right? That's one of the constraints that was introduced over 10 years ago, although there has been immense talk about how it doesn't make any sense and it should be changed. It's very hard to change afterwards, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some things have changed, as for instance, the number of varieties and the THC limit. Initially, the THC levels were extremely low for the cannabis that was sold to consumers. That became better now, but it took a lot of time and effort to introduce very small changes, liberalizing the market for adult use in Uruguay. And to me, that is an example that if you start from a very strict framework, it is then possible, but very hard to liberalize that market down the road. And I think the Uruguayan example is a prime example of that because of all the years that went by and how little the initial regulatory framework changed. It changed in bits here and there, but
Super
it's still very similar to the initial days.
Super interesting. I think another example on the other side would be looking at Thailand. How, for me, it's like the West has overregulated cannabis without understanding it. And now we have those patterns that you just mentioned, which is really hard. It's almost obvious to everybody, even regulators, how tough it's become for operators or to even make this happen as we have done. Whereas in the East or in Thailand, I feel like there was a huge lack of regulations, but then they learned from the impact of those lack of regulations and slowly but surely started putting in those check marks. And now I feel like we have a very progressive and good set of regulations. Of course, there still needs to be some tweaking and it's still very much a developing market. But in terms of the speed going from 0 or 10 years in prison with no operators to where we are 2 years down the line now, where the operators around the world are getting a little bit scared with this really high quality, low cost producer coming online or market coming online. I thought that was a great example of the other way of doing it. What is your perspective on that?
I don't know much about the situation in Thailand beyond, the headlines, but it's a great example, I guess, of the other way around, starting with free for all and then introducing the restrictions, obviously with hiccups and problems along the way. But you are telling me it's kind of working, right? You now have, I mean, I am aware that you now do have very serious operators.
The thing I realized was if you just open up a market without the right regulations, if you only decriminalize, the only thing you're doing is you're not really opening it up for illicit legal producers. Decriminalization basically just makes it easier for the illicit market. That's where you have that impact that the German government is trying to allude to, where the opening up of the market has actually just allowed them to operate in an easier fashion and therefore it benefited their illicit activities. But actually, really what happened in Thailand was it was just basically decriminalized at first, which drove the whole illicit market into Thailand. I mean, all of North America, it was crazy. I thought the first events in Thailand, you had like the craziest criminals plus the biggest like pharmaceutical and business guys showing up. It was the craziest like kind of clash of two worlds that I'd ever seen. But now the checks and balances are coming in, which make it tougher for the illicit market, but allowed for legal operators to learn, develop, and now compete.
And some may adapt to the new frameworks, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And it gave them an opportunity that otherwise they may never have.
But I can't deny that it was a huge boost to illicit activity at first with the lack of regulations. I mean,
was it a boost or it just brought it to light? I mean, maybe
I would say it was a boost because any operator that was scared of pharmaceutical production or expanding their operations outside of North America, Europe was never the answer for them. But every single one of those, it felt like made the first move to come to Thailand, right? On top of that, most suppliers that I spoke to had a queue of illicit buyers at the front of the facility saying, "I'm here to buy your whole stock." And they were allowed to, in front of the door of the facility, to just sign and sell with no paper trail, with no nothing. So that's why we saw, I think the number, and these would be numbers that I actually would say make sense to illustrate this, is a huge surge in Thai cannabis being caught at the border. Again, this is coming through freights or shipping, like water or airways. But I mean, even the UK government, there was like, I think the BBC put out an article where they had to call the Thai government and say like, can you guys
Specifically.
control your shit because there's too much product coming in here.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah.
And I guess that's also a difficulty of cannabis policy, is that you can think of, the perfect regulatory framework, if there's such a thing, for a specific country, but then that country is not isolated from the rest of the world, right? So that explains a bunch of things. Also about the initial example of Uruguay, that was very bold in being the first one to legalize on a country level, but it was also very restrictive. And I would say part of these restrictions were also consideration towards its neighbors and the international community, because it took courage to be the first one. But then you cannot just go ahead and do it free for all. It had to be in a very measured way, perhaps too measured.
Too measured.
Well, 10 years later, it looks too measured, right?
Yeah. You're completely right. Alfredo, I wanted to point out another thing that's happening currently. For people that don't know, obviously, what makes Germany quite unique as a medical market is the reimbursement that people get from their medical insurance. So their cannabis is completely reimbursed. The majority of the market are self-paying, meaning that they don't get it fully reimbursed. But now the GKV is threatening to remove the reimbursement of flowers in the market. Can you speak to that a little bit? And where
Sure.
did this come from? What's happening?
Yeah, that's something that is quite unique of Germany, right? Newcomers to the German cannabis industry these days may often even ignore that initially the market was driven by reimbursed flower, right? Things changed to the so-called private self-payer truly in 2021 and after 2021, especially after 2024. But in the initial years, the market was driven by cannabis being reimbursed by the public health system. And the situation that we have now, as you correctly said, is that there's a proposal, but it's a high priority proposal to do a bunch of things, 66 measures, I think it is, to try to fix the German public health system, which is basically broke, or at least it will be broke in the future if things continue in this trajectory, right?
Yeah.
So there's a bunch of measures there to try to save money or even get money for the public health system. Yeah, without going into detail in any of the non-cannabis related measures, among the 66, I think it is measures, there's one there which is basically to remove reimbursement for medicinal cannabis flower, only for flower. If adopted, what that would mean would be that patients currently having their cannabis flower reimbursed would either have to switch to extracts,
Which is then still reimbursed, right?
Extracts would continue to be reimbursed as per the proposal. I don't know if the switch from flower to extracts would be automatic or they would need to get a new approval for extracts. Maybe they would. I don't remember that.
New prescription, probably then.
Maybe even a new approval, because as a reminder, to get cannabis reimbursed by the public health system in Germany, talking about cannabis flower or full spectrum extracts, products that are not drugs like Sativex or Epidiolex, you need to do an application to the public health system, and each individual application is analyzed and approved or even rejected. So that's why the cannabis that is reimbursed under the public health system hasn't really grown so much in the past years, whereas the cannabis being paid out of pockets has grown so fast because, you just go and pay for it and it's simple. Whereas if you want to get it reimbursed by the public health system, you need to go through big or much bigger, at least, hurdles. Where I was that if this proposal were to be approved, then patients currently having flower reimbursed would need to either switch to extracts or start paying for the flower out of their own pocket. The rationale for that is, in the proposal itself, is basically one, of course, saving money. And I'll tell you in a minute how much could be saved or what the impact could be. And the second one is, in a very light, superficial analysis, they claim that there is no evidence or limited evidence to have cannabis flower reimbursed by the public health system. In terms of the impact that it could have, what we know is how much, as of now, is how much cannabis was reimbursed by the public health system up until Q3 2025, growing slowly but growing. If we simply annualize the first 3 quarters of 2025 to try to get a picture of the whole 2025 reimbursed cannabis market in Germany, that was, I think, around 250 million that was reimbursed, of which almost 130 million was flower.
Got you.
The remainder being extracts or dronabinol preparations. And I think also included in the 250 million number is Sativex and Epidiolex reimbursement. If the proposal were to be adopted, that would mean that the industry would be simply a shift from flower to extracts, but
Category question.
category thing. Or maybe some of these patients start buying out of pocket. Again, kind of a category change. It's still flower, but instead of reimbursed by insurance, paying out of pocket, which would probably mean lower prices as well. Or the third scenario, and it's probably going to be a mix of the three things, if this is adopted, is so one is extracts, second is start paying out of pocket, or if they cannot pay it, or they find an illicit market opportunity that is they think is better than paying out of pocket, illicit market, right?
Yeah. Also back in 2017 or even before that, when that initial group of reimbursed patients joined, it was much more expensive flower, right? So they're actually coming back into a market where the price compression has just benefited them massively.
Yeah, true.
Which is quite nice.
I remember the days of 20 euros plus.
Yeah.
And for context, so 130 million flower, reimbursed flower market in 2025 is a fraction of the total flower market last year that I estimate was around 1 billion. So you could say a bit more than 10%.
Yeah. And I know this number has been dropping in terms of applications being accepted by, is it the GKV to reimburse cannabis? So it's like under 20% of the applications. I have 12% in my head, but it was definitely under 20% that are actually being approved. Do you have any visibility on that, or is it becoming harder?
The last time that I personally did some research about it was many years ago when I was still at MJBizDaily. I don't remember exactly what year it was, but it was probably around 2020. And I remember reaching out to basically the top 10 or whatever number of public health insurers in Germany that cover, I don't know, 80% or more of the public health market in Germany, and asking them for data on applications and rejections. And off the top of my head, back then, if I remember correctly, around a third of the applications were rejected.
Okay.
But I'm talking about many years ago. And I honestly don't know if any new research has been done on
like
that.
a year or something ago, I just saw how that number was dropping significantly
That more applications
were being rejected.
Could be.
Yeah.
I mean,
and especially for flowers.
Yeah.
Already, I mean, even before this is coming in, it seems like there has already been a favoritism towards extracts. And
could be. You still see growth in the reimbursed market, limited growth. I think we're talking about single-digit year-over-year growth, but it is not that that market is decreasing. It's just growing slowly. But yeah, if flower were to be removed, let's say from the catalog, I mean, it's not a catalog, but if it were to be stopped being reimbursed, that could have a big impact in the reimbursed market. In the overall market, I would say it would be probably more limited, but it's also a signal, right? It's a signal that the current government is, attacking the market from different angles, and this is one of these angles.
Absolutely. I think as we're coming towards the end now, we're still waiting on these new regulations to be determined in the German market. What would you say people need to be prepared for? What can people expect? Whether this is a North American trying to move in to the European market or German market, but also for German operators, what is there to look out for in your perspective?
That's a very tough question, right? Scenarios. I mean, I tend to think of these things in scenarios. I mean, you can try to assign probabilities of different things playing out, but in this uncertainty where things could go in many different ways, I think the best thing you can try to do is to think in scenarios.
And planning scenarios.
And yeah, if some things are within the organization control, but many things are not, right? It depends on whatever political whim of the moment. So yeah, I guess prepare for the different positive or not so positive scenarios.
Is there like one or two main risks that are still kind of on the knife's edge to being determined whether that's a risk or not? Is there any two or three that you're really like, okay, these are the ones I'm keeping an eye on?
One risk is the current law amendment to medicinal cannabis being in Germany being approved as it is currently written, then failing to achieve the general outcome that it expects to achieve, which is basically restricting and arguably reducing the market by means of heavy restriction on telemedicine and pharmacy delivery. And then seeing that either through existing loopholes in the current drafting or through industry creativity, those outcomes are not achieved. And then a next government unfriendly towards cannabis, if that happens to be the case, says this was not enough. We need to do something even harsher, right?
Mm-hmm.
And always have this cat and mouse game in which there's a new stricter measure being proposed or adopted, trying to introduce frictions in the system and the system then adapting and, having this game back and forth all the time. I think we saw it in the example of Poland in Europe, where telemedicine was basically banned back in 2024, around November, I think it was 2024. Initially, the market went to probably close to half of its previous monthly volume in the initial months of that. But then what I always, and not just I, but what many people say is that demand just doesn't disappear because you pass a law, right? The demand is still there. So the industry adapted, found ways to still provide access to patients. And the result 1 year later, so at the end of 2025, was that measured in monthly volumes dispensed to patients, the market was actually higher than before the telemedicine ban. So what did that achieve? Just, making things more complicated.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the demand doesn't disappear. So I think that's the biggest issue that I see, that sometimes things are proposed to try to introduce frictions and restrictions without escape valve for the demand that is still there.
Yeah, so it just creates like short-term struggles for operators and maybe even patient access, but at the end of the day, it will prevail.
Yeah, I would say so, right? The industry is very creative to find solutions because the demand is there. The demand is not going away. And I think that's the key thing that is being ignored often in these conversations. Try to find ways to restrict supply, basically. All right, but what are you going to do with the demand that is already there? That's the big issue, right?
Is there a market that is now coming online or something that excites you or that you find interesting from a regulatory perspective that we haven't discussed today?
Everything is interesting in the cannabis industry. Every jurisdiction has its own peculiarities, and every market. I mean, I was recently fascinated by the case study of Poland, and I was so fascinated that I even wrote a specific report about it, because I certainly was a bit naive and I didn't expect that the market was going to recover volume-wise so quickly. Especially after the initial impact of the telemedicine ban, I thought, all right, this will recover, but it may take years. But no, took 1 year. 1 year to recover in volumes.
Wow.
In sales, it was a bit lower in 2025 compared to 2024 because price compression. But in volumes, it was basically 1 year all it took to recover. So I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah.
And I guess the other thing that is fascinating is that right now we are seeing somewhat comparable conversations in different countries, be it the UK or Australia or Germany, to try to introduce frictions in the system because the market is growing too fast. Too many patients are having access to cannabis. That must be wrong.
At least
that's the thinking of some policymakers. So simplifying their thinking is the industry is out of control. We need to introduce frictions in the system to bring the industry to its knees. No, I'm exaggerating, but maybe something that way. But again, what they are not addressing is the demand that is still there, and it's not going away.
Yeah. Alfredo, one last thing I wanted to go over is kind of some sort of understanding of the market sizes, what markets are going quicker than others, which ones are bigger than others. Can you give a quick summary on that and what you're seeing?
Yeah. Given we are in early 2026, I think a good way to look at it is how big the markets were in 2025, particular jurisdictions. We briefly mentioned before the German market, based on import data and the expectation of how much of what is imported is actually sold to patients, which is not 100%, it's lower than that, and estimated average price per gram last year. The flower market in Germany last year was about 1 billion in euros. And to keep it very simple, as a rule of thumb, and I'm simplifying a lot, so be aware of that. The second one outside North America would then be Australia, which was about half the size of the German market, let's say around 500 million euros. And for Australia, we don't have as updated import data as we have for Germany. So a bunch of assumptions are going into that number. And rounding it to keep it as a simple rule of thumb, Germany 1 billion, Australia 500 million in euros. And the third one, again in euros, and again simplifying a lot because we have very limited information in terms of full 2025 import numbers, is the UK. And for the UK, simplifying a lot, if you just want to remember the numbers, you could say it was in 2025, half of the Australian market being 250 million euros. Again, I'm overly simplifying the three markets, but a simple way to remember it is, all right, in 2025, Germany was 1 billion, Australia half of that, and UK half of Australia, all in euro equivalent. Well, Israel, I don't know, honestly, the size of the Israeli market. Perhaps that's the other one.
Shortly after recording this podcast, Alfredo corrected this, saying that Israel actually took the third place, with roughly higher patient sales in the UK at around 250 to 300 million in euro equivalent.
But that's history, right? And what matters for companies more than history is what's happening in 2026 and the next years. And there you see more growth in Germany and the UK. That's certainly the areas of growth.
Would you put Poland as number 4 to that?
Yeah, most likely. Poland was in revenue in 2025 around 60 million, so sub 100, right? I don't think, again, talking only about outside North America and talking about the typical high THC flower market, so ignoring, for instance, CBD in Brazil or things like that, and also ignoring Sativex and Epidiolex sales.
Mm-hmm.
But talking about what we are typically interested in, which is the cannabis flower markets or full spectrum extracts.
Mm-hmm.
But a fifth one, I cannot think of a fifth legal medicinal cannabis market that had over 100 million euro equivalent sales in 2025. Certainly, Germany was the largest one.
And I think we're really seeing, so much competition, price compression, especially in the German market, that we're now also seeing German operators looking at Poland and the UK as the next market of growth.
Yeah,
in a sense.
Still healthier margins. Yeah,
healthier margins. I guess that's a big point. But what is anything you can speak to? What's next for you? Anything you're excited about?
Well, I guess it depends on the timing of when this is going to be published. But what I can say is that I'm fully back in the cannabis industry now, 100%.
We missed you. Never felt like you were really gone, but we missed you as a source of truth and sensible policy.
Thank you for that. Yeah, so expect more of me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to have you on for a fifth time. Absolutely. Yeah. Give it a couple months for some regulations to change or excite us. And love to have you on again to pick your brain on that.
My pleasure being here.
Thank you so much, Alfredo.
Appreciate it.
Fuck yeah.
You liked it?
I loved it, man. I loved it.
The Cannabis Conversation, powered by Lumino. As always, thank you for joining us, and do subscribe or follow this podcast to be the first to catch future episodes.